It's October 18, 2008. This is Maximize Utility. Today, some more jargon from the world of social science and business economics, except this time I'm going to give you some pieces of jargon that I tell you should beware of. If you look at the terms I have up on the board there, since they have been keeping the data, standard deviation, by definition, and then that group there suggests, hints, indicates, associated with. These things, when you see them in an article, they may sound authoritative, but they're really tip-offs that there's some basic fallacy or some basic flaw in the case that somebody's trying to make. Since they have been keeping the data, you're reading some article, somebody's trying to prove some point that some data series is off the boards. And he says the data series is the highest it's been since they have been keeping the data. But how long have they been keeping the data? I'll give you a glaring example of this. In the 2000s, we were told that mortgage rates for something like a 30-year fixed mortgage, they were in the 5s, maybe around 6, and we were told these were the lowest rates of all history since they have been keeping the data. I could show you dozens of articles where they say that exact thing, that the mortgage rates were the lowest they've been in all history. Then they would say since they have been keeping the data. And then they might have mentioned that the data really goes back to about 1971 to a certain mortgage series that Fannie Mae put out. But what they don't tell you is that from about 1971 into the 1980s, inflation had gone up and was high, such that all rates were high, and those rates really weren't good to compare to rates today. The rates for the last 10 years or so had been in the 5 or 6 range, maybe as high as 7 or 8, depending. But what they also don't tell you is that, in fact, there's data going back before 1971. I got it here as 100 years of rates, but there's mortgage rates going back for so many years. But in the 50s and the early 60s and before that, mortgage rates were generally in the 5s. The mortgage rates today in the 2000s are no lower than mortgage rates have been throughout almost all history. So when you see an article that says mortgage rates are the lowest in all history since they have been keeping the data, beware. Standard deviation, it describes the spread of data around a mean. Let me just give you a quick example of it. Let's say you have the heights of men. 30 men walk into a room. One guy's 72 inches, another guy's 67. You can add up all those heights, get a sum, divide it by the number of observations, you get a mean. 70 inches, 5'10". You can take that mean and take each observation and get the deviation from the mean. You can go ahead and square that number. You add up those squares of the deviations. You divide it by the number of observations minus 1. Take the square root of that. You'll get the standard deviation. You not just know the average height of the men there, but how they're spread. And you know most men are, I'd say 95% of men are between 5'6" and 6'3". To get a man who is 700 standard deviations away from the mean, say 500 feet tall, would be truly out of the ordinary. Do you know any 500 feet tall men? So you wouldn't expect to find somebody who's 700 standard deviations away. So when something's many standard deviations away from mean, it's something extraordinary. Now I'll tell you, if you've got good data and you've got enough observations and certain other things, like there's a certain kind of spread of data, a bell curve, whatever, then the standard deviation has a lot of meaning. But usually when you see people talking about the standard deviation, where they're saying something extraordinary happened, they're misunderstanding some basic principle. I'll give you a compelling example. In the 1990s, there was this great commodities investor. His name was Victor Niederhofer. He was putting up some pretty good numbers, beating the market, something like that. And I would say, in my opinion, he was probably considered the greatest investor in the world for a period in the 1990s. It got to the point where he even wrote a book. It was called The Education of a Speculator. Not many investors write a book. You have to be doing something really crazy. Well, it went to his head, and he decided that he was indeed very out of the ordinary. Here's a quote from his book, talking about his investing. In statistical terms, I figure I have traded about 2 million contracts in my life thus far, with an average profit of $70. This average profit is approximately 700 standard deviations away from randomness. A departure would occur by chance only about as frequently as the spare parts in an automotive salvage lot spontaneously assembling themselves into a McDonald's restaurant. In other words, he's saying that his average was so far above zero, which is what you would expect in an efficient market, and it happened so frequently that he was 700 standard deviations away from a mean. So think about a man who's 68 feet tall, if the standard deviation of men's heights is about 2 inches, something like that. Well, maybe a year later, Victor Niederhofer would get wiped out. In fact, he wasn't 700 standard deviations away from an average of zero. He was maybe 2 or 3. In particular, he really hadn't traded 2 million contracts. Most of those contracts were redundant, the same thing. And he probably only traded maybe on an order of a few thousand independent trades. Also, the distribution underlying the activity he was involved in perhaps was not a normal distribution. Anyway, he was wrong, and the warning is, Be very careful before you characterize yourself as being 700 standard deviations away from a norm. You often hear the term by definition, and it applies in many fields and in many concepts. You might hear it in math, certain things are defined a certain way, or it might be true in law, or at a certain age you're defined as something. In social science, we have all kinds of definitions too. And the question you have to ask is it just a conventional definition? We could have defined it some other way, or does it imply something? If somebody says this is true by definition, and something's changed, and then something else has to change with it, is there some kind of hook? Is something forcing something else? And for example, we have the national income accounts. We say that GDP, that's Y, equals C plus I plus G plus net X, that's X minus M. So GDP equals all that we consume, plus all that we invest, plus all that we do through government, plus all that we export minus what we import. Now that has to be true by definition. Is it important? Does it really represent economic things that we're doing? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Let's say C, I, G, and X was 0. Then if we wanted to bring Toyotas in from Japan, which we do every year, we'd have to have negative GDP, by definition. Isn't that right? Let me give you an example where somebody, I think he states by definition, but I don't think he knows what he means. So the question is, when somebody says by definition, is he just saying something he really doesn't understand what the definition is? Or does he understand that there's an economic meaning to it, or an economic magnitude, and a cause and effect? So here's an example. You could find many, many, many examples like this, especially about trade numbers. It's Randall Forsythe, writer for Barron's, back a couple of years ago. He says, the U.S. now is running a current account deficit of 7% of GDP. That gap, by definition, represents how much less America saves than it invests. And I'll tell you that is true by the defining of those accounts like I put on the board there. But a lot of economists will tell you that that really isn't the key. It depends on other factors, and the 7% really isn't the economically important magnitude. Maybe it's higher, who knows? Maybe it's lower. Some economists will say it's lower. But does Randall Forsythe know? Does he think that just because by definition you get a certain number, that gives you the number that's the thing we have to deal with? You'd have to ask Randall Forsythe, because I can't tell by the context of what he's written whether he understands it or not. When you see these terms in some newspaper article describing some research done by some researcher, beware. The analyst is often trying to find cause and effect where probably either it doesn't exist or we know it exists, or it exists at a very, very low level, but the person's trying to hype it a little bit. And you see things like research suggests, or trends indicate, or evidence hints. And when you see them again, beware. The person doing the research or the journalist describing it might have very little conviction about his or her idea, but they just want to believe it. And in general, in society, a lot of factors move together. We call it multicollinearity, to use a fancy term out of econometrics, and it's hard to tease out cause and effect. If I went out to try to find examples of these terms, I could find thousands of them. Here's one. Despite evidence that TV viewing is associated with childhood obesity and other problems, just beware when you see those terms. They often are indicators of very weak research with very little conviction. So am I being mean to investor Victor Niederhofer and journalist Randall Forsythe and others? I say no. I say there's a lot of real amateur science out there. Beware when you see those terms.